the benefits of being a mission-driven business were huge because it attracted, employees and customers, right? And it allowed us to create a brand that, that stood for something. And I think people felt, certainly I felt that this way, that, I wasn't just making widgets, I was, making the world a better place. And I think that was important to me. And I think a lot of people who joined the company, that was important. And then I think that came through to our customers who were like, this company is about more. It's just about more than just, selling me an individual device. On the performance culture part, I think that's really important.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Built Not Born, the startup go-to-market podcast by Venture Guides. I'm Sage Nye, and around here, we believe that great companies are built, not born, one smart decision at a time. Each week, we take you through real conversations with founders, investors, and go-to-market experts on what it really takes to land customers and scale your startup. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to Built Not Born, the podcast where we dive into the real stories behind startup execution, venture capital, and go-to-market strategy. I'm Sage Nye, partner here at Venture Guides. Today's guest has built a company that you have definitely heard of, and many of you have probably used in your own homes. At ecobee, Stuart Lombard co-invented the smart thermostat, got rejected by VCs 172 times, which we will be covering later. And one finally funded him. He raised capital, was a market leader, and then was gut punched by a 10,000-pound gorilla. Instead of giving in, Stuart raised ecobee's game and focused on what they could offer that his competition could not, partnered with the smart device ecosystem, and preserved data privacy. Ultimately, by always putting customers first, Stuart out-customered the giant and became a time-recognized 200 best inventions of 2022, along with many, many accolades, I should add. Over 16 years, he turned ecobee into one of the most beloved smart home brands on the planet, and his customers have collectively saved over 30 terawatt hours of energy, which, if you're wondering, is enough to take Los Angeles and Chicago off the grid for an entire year. He sold the company to Generac without ever losing sight of the reason why he started it, to fight climate change. So, Stuart, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
I'd love to start by giving the audience a little bit of background from your perspective. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Sure. So entrepreneur by training, not entrepreneur by training, engineer by training, accidental entrepreneur. Actually, I was going to go to business school, and so I quit. And I was out west, and I was skiing, and I was bored, and I wrote a business plan for an internet service provider in 1994. And rather than going to business school, I took the money that I was going to spend at business school, and I started one of Canada's first internet service providers, which became Canada's largest internet service provider. And we, took that company public, and then I had the bug. And so I've started a couple of companies. The most recent one was ecobee. And in between, I spent 8 years as a partner in a venture capital firm.
Wow. I got to say, I'm a customer of ecobee. I've shared some of the funny stories about I can change the temperature in my home for the people that are there, even when I am not, which has led to a lot of amusement for myself.
It's a wonderful feature.
But crazy background and definitely puts into context, the next time our listeners are bored, they could scroll LinkedIn or Instagram, or they could start a company. And what a wild experience. I'd love to jump into some of the story of ecobee. You've talked about getting rejected by venture capitalists 172 times. Most entrepreneurs would have given up on trying to fundraise and build a company well before that period. What kept you going? And was there something that you were able to learn from those rejections?
Yeah, it was certainly very difficult. I mean, when we started, I was very excited about our business, as entrepreneurs are. And, I went to all these VCs and I was like, hey, we've got this great $250 thermostat. And they were like, Stuart, nobody cares about thermostats, right? And no one's going to pay $250 for a thermostat. And then after, Nest came out, all the venture capitalists were like, of course, everybody wants a $250 thermostat, but, the market's already been won, life is too short, fail fast, go home and do something productive with your life. And, I remember I have one vivid memory of a day kind of like today. It was a freezing cold day in Toronto. The wind was blowing and I had just been rejected for probably the 170th time. And I went down the elevator and, went out on the street. And, when you go in the old days, you went through the phalanx of people smoking outside the buildings. And I'm not a smoker, but I was like so stressed. I was like, I bummed a smoke of someone and I stood on the corner and I was like, should I quit? Should I quit? Should I quit? And I said, you know what? I'm not quitting. And, I just kind of resolved to keep going. And I think, when you read lots of people's venture stories, it's a lot about, resilience and perseverance and resourcefulness. And that's really what it took. And in the end, everything turned out well. And so, it worked out well. But I think that idea that, if you put your mind to something and you're willing to work hard, you can really achieve anything. And I think that was the biggest lesson. I guess the other lesson, which, Scott Adams has this great quote, which is, venture capitalism is the only profession where you get paid an outrageous amount of money to be wrong 90% of the time. And so, I think VCs are super smart and, they have a lot of good ideas, but, nobody has a perfect view of the future. And I think, as a CEO, one of your toughest challenges is figuring out which advice to take and which advice to ignore. And, thankfully for us, I ignored that advice. And so, that was another piece of learning that maybe take away from it.
Did it help put a chip on your shoulder to just want to prove all 172 wrong and build like the biggest company and do all of that, or not quite?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to joke that I'd tell people I was like, I'm actually 7 feet tall, but because I have all these chips on my shoulders, I'm just 6 feet tall. But it was definitely motivation, I think, to prove people wrong. And however you need the motivation, it definitely helped.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting. Most of the companies that we talk to on this podcast, and frankly, in the market that we spend time in as venture guides, are pure software companies. But ecobee, to your point, had the $250 thermostat, smart thermostat, which is obviously hardware and software dependent. What are some of the biggest differences and challenges that you saw building a sort of hardware and software company versus your previous ones, which were mostly software?
Some of the differences are cultural and some of the differences are structural, right? And so, one of the things that I didn't appreciate was a cultural difference was, hardware development tends to be very waterfall. And if you think about having a retail product for sure, where, you need to be on store in, let's say, Home Depot, and Home Depot has told you, like, you have a week window, May 7th to May 12th. And, if your product doesn't show up that day, it's not going to be in store and the next date is in September, right? And so your work back schedule, creates this waterfall, right? And to get to all the different things together to happen at the same time. And our software teams were like, we don't plan ahead. Like, we want to plan in sprints, right? So if it's longer than 2 weeks, I have no clue what's going to happen, right? And one of the strengths and opportunities of being a hardware company is that you have to put your stuff in packaging and you have to print the packaging. And so it's like, if the feature is on the box and we can't ship it on time, like, we're in deep trouble, right? And so culturally managing that, I think, was something that was, really quite interesting and maybe unexpected. I think the other thing is that, fail fast and break things doesn't work in hardware, right? And so when you put, devices into millions of people's homes, and, not that, I mean, heating and cooling is sort of, I mean, it's not like a, it's not like a pacemaker, so it's not that mission critical, but, people want their heat to work. And so
frozen pipes and leaks and
Yes, exactly. So you can't afford, to make mistakes. And, if you brick devices or if you have a safety issue, and you have to recall those devices from the field, it's incredibly expensive, and it probably, takes the company under. And so you have to be very, meticulous and careful. And, and we thought a lot about that to make sure, we had an instance, for example, where our manufacturer decided to change the assembly instructions, all for good reasons, but they got it wrong, unfortunately. And, before you know it, you've got, hundreds of thousands of broken devices in the field that you have to get back. And so it's painful. And then, of course, the other thing is all around, things like inventory and supply chain and managing your inventory. I think sort of also how you take risk is a problem, like, because your development cycle is so fixed and, we need to get this product to market by this date. You can't take a lot of risk in that product development process. And so what we realized is that, we wanted to create these new features that were super exciting for consumers, but they came with risks, right? We didn't know whether we could actually accomplish them or not. And so we had to actually create like a whole different labs track which was separate from our production track, where we could take risks and innovate and prove out technologies before they went into a product. Because of course, if you got halfway through the process and you realized that, that new air quality sensor that you wanted to use that you thought was such a great idea didn't work, right? Then all of a sudden your whole process was behind like a year or something like that. So those were some of the challenges we had.
Well, and when you think about taking risks as well, I imagine inventory management is quite hard because I think you said Home Depot earlier, use that example. You have a certain window to get the products on the shelves or to get them the products to put on the shelves. But you also need to make sure it's enough products that people there's something for someone to buy until you can restock, but not too much where you've put too much on the shelves and then you don't have enough for somewhere else, or it's too much capex or something. How do you think through questions like that?
It's a great question. I mean, we used to joke like we can't pay ourselves in thermostats, right? So that was sort of like the stick was like, okay, if we get this wrong, we're all getting paid in thermostats, and thermostats, you can't pay the rent with thermostats. And so it's a big problem. It's a big challenge also because, your retail partners don't necessarily know what's happening in their own stores, right? And so, forecasting becomes really, really important. And there are about 500 components that go into an ecobee thermostat. So getting all those components at your manufacturer at the right time, in just the right quantities. So to your point, you don't use up too much working capital, is a big challenge. Forecasting demand, I think in any business is a challenge. And then forecasting what's happening in your retail stores is also a big challenge. And so, we used some pretty incredible machine learning models to predict what was happening in stores. One of the things that was really interesting is that, you think most stores would sell roughly the same amount of units, but our top quartile stores sold, 16 times more than our bottom quartile stores. So it was like, bottom quartile was, let's say, 1 times unit. Next quartile was 4, next was 8, next was 16, right? So if you lost a top quartile store, that was really bad. And so anyway, so being able to predict what was happening in store, and that could be things like your display goes down or your partner doesn't put inventory on shelves. We had a situation where one of our partners, they didn't actually merchandise the product for like 3 months, but they didn't know it. They were like, oh, no, sales are just slow, right? But we could figure out through this machine learning algorithm that they actually hadn't put the units on the shelf. And so a lot of it is around, sort of detailed forecasting and understanding, what's happening in the field, and then having a strategy. And we had all these algorithms that kind of predicted safety stock and how many components of everything that we needed based on lead times and all that kind of stuff.
That's really impressive, especially putting into context that you were well before the age of AI when you could just point a model at it and have it tell you insights and answers. You actually had to come up with the algorithms to figure it out yourself. Really impressive. So along those lines, ecobee has grown from a tiny startup to over 600 employees, and it grew to that scale in about 16 years, which is really impressive, especially when you think about all of the complications that go into this type of business. Were there moments when you realized that your current mode of operations couldn't scale and you had to shift? And then how did you recognize that in those moments?
I think, one of the biggest challenges for me personally, as a CEO, was reinventing myself. And I really felt like I had to reinvent myself every couple of years because, being 10 people in a business is different than being 50 people in a business, different than 200, different than 600. How you communicate, and, how you operate the business is very, very different. And I think, some of those things are like, you're sitting at your desk and you hear someone say like, I don't understand our strategy, or I don't know why we do what we do. And you're like, oh my God, like to me anyway, that was like a heart attack. Because I was so used to working with like 12 people, everybody knew everybody. And if all of a sudden, like, somebody had a question, they would just turn around, swivel their chair and, and talk to you. And then there was a period where we grew from like 200 employees to 400 employees. And, all of a sudden we realized like we were making the same mistakes that we had made previously. Right. And we had lost the institutional knowledge. Like we had gone through all these like incredibly difficult like processes where we had, gotten good at things and learned things. And then, because there were so many new people, how do you get those people up to speed? How do you help them learn? How do you help them not make the same mistakes? And so, those were some of the cues. Maybe one other one is, what I used to joke that, in the early days, the way we managed the business, we were like, 5-year-olds playing soccer. And if you ever watch 5-year-olds playing soccer, they're all glommed on the ball, and wherever the ball goes, they run with it. And that's sort of the way the business worked. And the kind of, the brain trust would, sort of follow the ball. And, and then all of a sudden you were playing on multiple fields, and, you just couldn't, or I just couldn't keep up anyway. And there's a great, Lucille Ball was a comedian in the 50s, and she has this great skit where she's in a chocolate factory, and her and her friend Ethel are putting chocolates into chocolate boxes, and they've got a conveyor belt, and then somebody speeds up the conveyor belt, right? And so they're like, sticking chocolates in their pocket, and they're like down their shirt, and they're eating them, and it's a complete mess. But that's the way that I felt, because the decisions were coming like faster and faster, and I was like, I couldn't keep up. And maybe one other, sort of just on the clue, and then I'll get to kind of like some of the things we tried to do was also like not being the smartest person in the room. And I don't mean that like conceitedly, like I was the smartest person in the room, but when you're 10 people, you're deeply involved in all the decisions get made. I knew pretty much what everyone was doing, and, all that kind of stuff. As we grew and we became, a lot more people, I didn't have that context anymore. And I probably wasn't a very good decision maker because I didn't really understand the context. And so what's my role in making decisions when I'm no longer, I'm really not all that up to speed on like all the details of the decisions that have to be made. And so I think, one thing was certainly putting in place like decision-making frameworks. So the first one was just, and Jeff Bezos talks about this too, as being sort of one-way door decisions, right? And just for me as a CEO, having a sieve of like, is this a bet the company decision, was a massive like stress reliever for me, because I used to treat every decision, as they were existential, right? And so I would stress about it and all that stuff. And then, that allowed me to sort of say like, this group of decisions I don't have to worry about so much, which was, a big deal. And then the second part was really defining our strategy. And so we used a framework called Playing to Win, this great book, Playing to Win by Roger Martin and A.G. Lafley, that sets up this very simple matrix about, what are your aspirations? Like, what do you hope the business is? And that was the first eye opener for me, because I always thought people had the same aspirations as me. But when we actually started writing them down, people had like all kinds of different aspirations. And so that was the first thing. But I think knowing what you want to be and where you want to go is an important part of setting up your strategy. And then, where to play is kind of like which geographies, which products, which channels. So again, fairly straightforward. And then the other piece that became really helpful was like how to win. And that was concretely writing down how you win. And so, one of the things, for example, we realized when Nest came out was that, we were actually not that great, right? So I tell people like, we thought we were the champions. We were the only ones in the market at the time with a, smart thermostat, and people told us how great we were, but really we weren't playing in the NHL. We were playing like, intramural hockey somewhere, and we were the intramural champions, right? And then Nest came out and it was like, oh my God, there's this whole other league. And this idea of, wanting to be great, we always wanted to be great, but being great and wanting to be great are two very different things, right? And this idea of like how you win and setting out like what are the core competencies that you need to really win in the market, that was transformational. And so for us, for example, like we needed a world-class design team. We couldn't just kind of like, Bob's brother and, this person who's our, he's our designer as a mechanical engineer, and, because we were being resourceful and all that stuff, but it wasn't going to be good enough. And that, put a lot of pressure, I think, on me as the CEO to do some of those things. So for example, we were just talking about our forecasting ability. Well, one of the things we said early on was that, we needed to have world-class AI talent in the business. That we thought was going to be a decider for how well we did. And so we went out, probably in 2015, and we hired a AI team that worked on, products and all kinds of, ML challenges we had and stuff like that across the business. But that sort of level of organization and thoughtfulness about, what it takes to win, what's important versus your competitors, super, super important. And then that sort of strategy, that maybe changed like once every 3 years or something like that. Doesn't change a lot. But then that fed into our annual plans, which became our budgets. And then we used OKRs as sort of like our short-term planning. And because we didn't have OKRs when we started, it was kind of a free for all. And, I'd come into the office and I'd say something and people were like, okay, that's the new priority or whatever it was. And, OKRs allowed us to really, hold me accountable, but also to like hold teams accountable, to understand what everyone was doing.
And
then it
probably
really allowed us to,
empower,
sorry?
I was going to say, probably empower your direct reports as well.
Totally. Yeah. And a lot of the bottlenecks that we had were cross-team bottlenecks. Teams didn't know what the other teams were doing. So that was a way of exposing to all the teams. Here's what if you're the server or if you're the mobile team and you need somebody to write a server API for you, what the server team's doing and whether you're on their priority list or not. So therefore, whether your feature is going to ship or not. Right. And so that was pretty transformational for us.
That's awesome. So you brought up the story of Google and Nest, and I'd love to spend some more time on that because I do think, while maybe not the exact same experience, something similar happens to every company where you have exciting technology, you're bringing something new to the market, you build up a business, and then the problem is you get big enough that other people start paying attention, and a major company can come in, or someone with that background will build something, right? But and risk totally disrupting you. And so can you take us through sort of what your first reaction was in the moment, but then also how did you think about the strengths of your business and how to move forward as opposed to just sort of giving up or trying to find an exit path?
Yeah, I think the first reaction was like, oh, we're so dead. Like that was the first reaction.
That would be most people's, yeah.
like pure panic. And I remember looking around the room and everyone was a bit shell shocked. And so I think, that was sort of the first reaction. I think that, in Good to Great, Jim Collins talks about, having a worthy competitor. And I think having a worthy competitor is really an important concept. And certainly in our case, they made us better. Like it forced us to really raise our game. I think, before Nest, we were, we'd come up with an idea that was pretty amazing. And then we'd be like, okay, that never works, or that'll never work, or it'll take too long, or it's too hard, or it's too whatever. And so we sort of sold a great idea down to, let's say, 80%. And then let's say our execution was 80%. So then you got like a 56% solution that really wasn't all that great, to be honest. And so they really forced us to lift our game, as we talked about, to think about what it takes to really win, what capabilities we have to be really good at. But then we also realized that, their greatest strengths are also their greatest weaknesses. And, because they were so big, there were things that we could do that they could not do, right? And so, for example, one of the things we came up with was customer service. And we felt like customer service, because installing, smart home devices can be relatively complicated. Like, customer service was important for our customers, and we thought Google will never do customer service properly, or, it's just not in their ethos. And sustainability was another one where we thought, like, Google is this tech company. We can talk about sustainability. They can't necessarily talk about sustainability. And then we could use their strength against them, because they were spending, the whisper numbers were they were spending, or losing $500 million a year in that business. And they were, Super Bowl ads and a whole bunch of other things. And so, how do we draft behind that awareness that they're creating? And really that was around customer reviews. We believe that customers were going to do research, and, if we had great customer reviews, they would pick us. And so, we monitored things like NPS religiously and really focused on, customer reviews. And then maybe the last thing was really around, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so, when we looked at, Google, who are Google's enemies? Well, at the time, Apple and Amazon were, competing on a whole bunch of fronts. And so, we felt like if we couldn't win in the Apple ecosystem or the Amazon ecosystem, like something must be very wrong with us. And so we developed very close relationships with Amazon and Apple. And, that served us really well, because for people who wanted to be in the Amazon or the Apple smart home ecosystem, ecobee was the choice. So if you were Google, you were going to go Google. It was okay. We were going to probably lose that battle anyway. But if you're one of these other customers in these other ecosystems, that gave us a huge opportunity to win. And we really got some brand halo from those two businesses, which were super supportive in our own development, which was helpful.
That's awesome. So it sounds like the first thing you did was you had to sort of take a second and realize what the situation was, but then figure out, okay, what are our specific strengths as a company, as a brand? What can we do that they can't? And then not just what can we do alone, but what are the partners that can help, give us that exponential lift, to your point at the end as well. Do I have that correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Really great. Okay. So I know we're nearing the end of the session, and I do really appreciate your time. I have a couple rapid fire questions that we hear from the founders that we talk to a lot, and I'd love to get your perspective on it. The first one is, you've spoken and worked with many VCs at this point, venture capitalists. How do you think about what to look for, how to pick the right venture capitalist partner?
I think, first of all, a big part of it is the rapport with the individual partner. The firm is important. But I think the rapport that you have with the individual partner is the most important. That's the person who's likely going to sit on your board. That's the person who you're going to interact with most. And so I think that's the most important thing. Certainly their reputation, I think, is really important. And, their ability to, bring additional capital, I think, is important. And I think it's okay to lay out, here's what I want from my VC partner. And so depending on who you are, you might want, help building the business, like operational experience, or you might say like, I've already got that. Thank you. Like, I don't need any more help. Right. But I think that, that's certainly important, other industry contacts, business development. There are a lot of things your venture capital partners can bring you. And so, thinking about those in advance and thinking about it more than just money, I think is really important. And then understanding the individual partners that you're going to be working with and having a good rapport with them, I think, are the most important things.
Makes a lot of sense. This next one's actually, I think, one that you've thought about a lot, particularly as you think about fighting climate change and that mission of ecobee as well. How do you think about building a mission-driven and or a performance-driven culture across your team? And are those in tension, or can they work together?
I think you need both, right? And so I think certainly for us, the benefits of being a mission-driven business were huge because it attracted, employees and customers, right? And it allowed us to create a brand that, that stood for something. And I think people felt, certainly I felt that this way, that, I wasn't just making widgets, I was, making the world a better place. And I think that was important to me. And I think a lot of people who joined the company, that was important. And then I think that came through to our customers who were like, this company is about more. It's just about more than just, selling me an individual device. On the performance culture part, I think that's really important. And having, one of the things we tried to create was a very open, transparent culture. And I always told people, you can disagree with me at any time, right? I am never going to be upset with you. If I'm going to walk off a ledge, I would really rather, you tell me before I walk off the ledge than after I hit the ground and you're like, I knew it, but I didn't want to say anything. And so, I mentioned it before. When we created our office, for example, we designed our office intentionally to foster collaboration and to make sure that, different people from different departments would interact with each other. Just a simple example, like every wall in the whole office was whiteboard, right? So if you had an idea, you could scribble it down at any time, or you could have an ad hoc meeting at any time. And then our lunchroom was like right in the middle of the office. And then adjoining the lunchroom was our hardware lab, right? Because it was sort of the center of what we did. So all of the prototyping and all that kind of stuff that we did, all of that was like sort of front and center so that people could, see what we were doing, could, understand what was coming, could, give people ideas or share ideas or whatever it was. And then I think, that idea of, holding each other accountable, and not in a negative way, right? But I think, people want to be part of successful teams, right? And so, understanding how you're doing, measuring success, doing better, those are important things. And again, those were things that, we were very transparent about. So everybody knew all our financials, everybody knew all of our, KPIs, everybody knew all our OKRs and our objectives, and so we could have frank conversations about, where we were succeeding and maybe where we weren't. But then that enabled us to course correct a lot faster.
Makes sense. And as you're thinking about, measuring and learning and all that, there's points in a company's life when you want to scale very quickly. And then there's also points where, it makes more sense to protect the balance sheet and maybe prove out a couple more challenges and stuff. How do you think about what indicators to look for or how to know that you're ready to scale?
I think there are really two. One is product market fit. And I think when you have good product market fit, you can really feel the market pulling your product. And so, sometimes it feels like a slog. Sometimes it's like, wow, orders are coming in and I didn't do a thing, right? And so that's a good time to scale. And then I think the second part is, making sure you have your, aligned to scalable economics in place, right? And so, if you lose more money, the more you sell, that's probably not a great thing. But if you have sustainable economics or aligned to sustainable economics, then that's a great time to scale.
Makes sense. All right. The couple last questions I have before we wrap are probably going to be some of the hardest ones. And the first one, I'll warn you, is the most difficult. Can you share one of your favorite memories from the creation and building of ecobee?
Yeah, I think, one of the greatest memories I have is when we launched ecobee 4. ecobee 4 was the first product with a voice assistant inside. And so, to kind of go back, you have to think about where we came from, which was like, Stuart, nobody cares about thermostats. And what are you going to do 6 months from now? Because thermostats are already as good as they are ever going to be back in the days where, they weren't even internet connected. Right? And, and here we were talking about, AI and ML and, voice and all that kind of stuff. And so, clearly we'd come a long way. And then, for a large part of our history, we had a twin, and we had this twin that was Nest, and, we were the black sheep twin. So we were like not as smart and not as funny, and, we had no personality, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and around that time, the narratives flipped, and we became equal or better than Nest. And I remember just walking into the office one day, and as I said, we had a hardware lab in the middle, and, we had this great open like lunch area where, people could gather and all that kind of stuff. And the office was a buzz. And I just remember thinking, like, we're getting better, right? Like, we just keep, every day you walk into the office and I feel like, we're doing things better and better and better. And it sort of started as kind of like a slow walk, and it just felt like we were getting better. And I was just so proud of the team, and all they'd accomplished, because it just felt like, what, we're world class, like we're good. And not only that, we're good, but getting better.
That must have been an amazing feeling. To that point, I think leadership goes a long way, and learning these leadership lessons. You talked about reinventing yourself so many different times throughout the build. What's a lesson that you wish more founders understood as they're growing their businesses?
Yeah, I think my favorite lesson is actually from Caddyshack, which is, that part where Chevy Chase is with Danny, and he's like, see your future, be your future. And I really feel like, a lot of the limitations that we put in place are limitations that we have, are limitations we put on ourselves, right? And this idea of having a clear vision of where you want to go, what you want to do, and then, striving to do that, I think is really in reach, and I think probably more in reach than a lot of people think. And so, see your future, be your future.
Fantastic. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really insightful, eye-opening for me, and all that goes into building a solution in a company like ecobee. And frankly, just a very fun conversation as well. Where can people learn more about you and your work these days?
Best place is on LinkedIn. So Stuart Lombard on LinkedIn.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I know that there's a lot to take away from this episode, and I'm excited for people to be hearing it.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on Built Not Born, the podcast where we break down the real stories of startup execution. If you enjoyed this conversation with Stuart Lombard, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And if you're a founder looking for guidance on scaling your startup, check out ventureguides.com. Thank you very much. Now let's get to work. Built Not Born, the Startup Go-to-Market podcast, is brought to you by Venture Guides. To find out more about Venture Guides and how our Venture Capital Plus guiding model helps early-stage startups build scalable go-to-market strategies and grow faster, visit ventureguides.com. And then make sure to search for Built Not Born in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, or anywhere else that you listen. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and we look forward to building with you. On behalf of the team here at Venture Guides, thanks for listening. Until next time, keep building.